afternoon, folks, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to visit with you this afternoon. Thanks to the program committee for the invitation. I much appreciate being able to visit anytime. I expect there's going to be a lot of questions. I sure hope so. We're going to have fun with this. The things that we're going to be talking about that I'll go over this afternoon, just a brief introduction of the Swine Health Information Center, looking over the hill and some of the things that we're watching for and keeping an eye on it, the responding and recovering of foreign animal disease, and also then this update on African swine fever and ongoing work, some of the lessons learned from the COVID situation, et cetera. So that's where we're going to start. And the first thing we'll do this afternoon is what is SHIC? And as Matt said, it's formed in 2015. The mission of the center is protect and enhance global disease monitoring. The issue there is to try to keep an eye on things that are going on around the world. And global means also domestically. So in the U.S., around the world, monitoring to try to predict things that may be coming at the U.S. pork industry, the diseases that may be happening, the research investments to minimize, to make sure that we can, as best we can, prevent, respond, and quickly recover from many of those things that we're monitoring. And then the other part of this is that there is a wealth of swine health data that has been compiled since 2015. Actually, it's since 2013 when PED broke. The sharing of information about PED and the background of that gave us a lot of opportunities to be able to look at data, to be able to better analyze data, and to be able to better then help the U.S. pork industry. So that's really the three things that SHIC is focused on. SHIC is a corporation in itself. It was formed by a grant from the National Pork Board, but it's a corporation, so it has a board of directors with the Pork Board, NPPC, AASV, and at-large members on the board of directors. The power of the Swine Health Information Center lies in the monitoring and analysis working group and the other working groups that we have, and the board of directors, a long list of names. But if you take a look, it's practitioners, producers, universities, associations, state animal health officials, USDA, a whole lot of collaboration going on with monitoring and analysis. And this group is just that. This group is the one that is charged with that looking over the hill, the boots on the ground, and analysis of data, and a preparedness and response working group where we have a group of collaborators and volunteers that look at our preparedness and also look at our response in the manner of the types of research that we need to fund, the types of things we need to get going to be able to make sure that we're ready and we can respond or we can prevent. So that's a brief introduction to the Swine Health Information Center. Looking over the hill and keeping an eye on it, one of the first things that I mentioned about the mission of the center. We have, internationally, we have an international swine disease monitoring program that is a project coordinated by University of Minnesota. We focus on classical swine fever, African swine fever, and foot and mouth disease, but we're also looking at different production diseases. There are hard sources, which are official sources, the official things that come from the countries or official publications about diseases around the world in different spots. There are also soft sources, and those are very important because those are the ones that, while they might not be official, they're probably quicker and something that gives us a heads up much more quickly than something officially coming from a source. So we put those two things together. University of Minnesota puts those two things together for us and compiles those things in a report that goes out in our newsletter once a month at the beginning of the month. We have USDA collaboration in this because they have an emerging issues resource center in Fort Collins as part of the Center for Epidemiology and Animal Health. And they also are doing monitoring of diseases. So we want to make sure that we're coordinated in that effort. And the disease reports can be found on the swinehealth.org website, or as I said, in the monthly newsletter. So if we're going to keep an eye on it internationally, this is an example of just some of the things. And I'm going to have more comments about some specifics. But China, Australia, Canada, around the world, looking and monitoring and following the progress of different diseases around the world. Long list in China, Australia, Canada. I'm going to talk some more about the hemorrhagic tracheitis syndrome that started in Canada and we're investigating. I'll spend some time on African swine fever in Vietnam, classical swine fever in Brazil, and classical swine fever in Japan as well. This is a fluid slide. This one changes, and of course, as things change around the world, we're going to add and take away to it as we monitor it. Foot and mouth disease, of course, is still with us in a lot of places around the world. Very active and something that maybe took a little bit of a back seat to African swine fever as that epidemic happened. But we got to remember that FMD is still out there. It's still very much a risk for the U.S. pork producers and the U.S. pork industry. Just yesterday, the USDA announced they have a $27 million purchase of foot and mouth disease vaccine for the FMD Preparedness Bank that they have. It's part of the $150 million effort that was included in the 2018 Farm Bill, and this is very good news. That 2018 Farm Bill includes foot and mouth disease vaccine purchases like this. It also includes NULN, or the Veterinary Diagnostic Lab support, and cooperative agreements with state animal health officials in states. So that's very important. That's all a very important cooperative project, and we're thankful that that $27 million was allocated to purchase foot and mouth disease vaccine specific for U.S. use in the case of an outbreak. More will be coming, but this is a good start. Classical swine fever, as I mentioned, Brazil and Japan. Classical swine fever is in Brazil, in the far northeast area of the country. It rears up every now and then and moves a bit, but it's pretty well localized in that area of the country, and that's away from the pork production and the pork industry for Brazil. So it's a lot of small farms, backyard farms types of things, and the Brazilian government manages that. In Japan, the outbreak of CSFs, primarily in the middle of the country, started in wild boar and wild pigs and moved to domestic. They've initiated a vaccine program for both their domestic and wild pigs. And we're watching how that works, because that might be a way that we can learn from about managing the disease. Now we'll move to ASF, and let's talk a little bit about ASF and what's going on. Of course, in Asia and Southeast Asia, the disease continues to move around in that area, including the islands and all of Southeast Asia. Let's talk about Vietnam for just a bit. About 30 million pigs. A lot of those are on their small farms. They have smaller number of large farms, and you see that on the slide. In 2020, there are approximately, and this is an approximate, 6 million pigs that have been culled, and we don't know how many have been lost. Estimates have been almost half of their production. They're in the process of repopulating now, both in China and Vietnam. That first wave has gone through. They're in the process of trying to repopulate and get their industries back up and running. It's going to be a big challenge because ASF is not gone in those countries, and they're going to have a challenge of the next wave of outbreaks that are going to happen in both of those areas in trying to increase their production while still trying to learn lessons and manage ASF as they go along. one of the areas of interest, it's not only Asia and Southeast Asia, but also Eastern Europe, and especially Poland. We import fresh pork from Poland, so there's a lot of interest in the situation in Poland and how their situation may or may not present a risk to the U.S. in that importation of fresh pork. This is a picture of the regionalization that the EU has put on Poland. The red, part 3, the red parts you see are where there are domestic and wild boar outbreaks. The pink, or the part 2, is a wild boar only outbreaks have been identified, and the blue is the at-risk areas that are in proximity to those other outbreaks. Started in the east part of the country, moved to the west part of the country, and found in wild pigs to begin with, in wild boar, but then has infected, you see the red, has infected domestic pigs on the west side. Some of the conclusions, we just talked to USDA about this within the last week, and these are USDA slides, and some of their conclusions is that it's present with occasional spillover, sufficient controls in the country to mitigate the likelihood of introduction, comprehensive surveillance systems, and emergency response plans, adequate movement controls, and export verification and certification systems ensure that exported pork and pork products meet U.S. import requirements. That's an important piece, an important statement by USDA. One of the things that we continue to talk to them about is watching this very closely and being able to respond very quickly. Most probably the likelihood of importation of ASF from Poland in fresh meat is an extremely low risk. There is no such thing as zero risk. Most likely it's an extremely low risk, but the problem is it's got such a high consequence. And our goal is preventing introduction of ASF into the country. So this issue of Poland and making sure that we can monitor, and along with USDA, to be able to prevent, not just respond to things coming in, but to prevent things from coming in is a very important one, and one that we're very closely working with USDA to try to help understand their process and better manage. Looking over the hill, as I said, in a global look, is not only internationally, but it's also domestically. We've been very welcome in a data standardization project with Iowa State, Kansas State, and the University of Minnesota and South Dakota State, that our veterinary diagnostic lab data is now standardized, and we're able to do some of that data mining for the domestic disease monitoring project. That is a report that also comes out monthly. It is managed by Iowa State University and looks at the trends for domestic diseases and swine diseases in the U.S. One of the other exciting things that we have going on is with the Morrison Swine Health Monitoring Project at the University of Minnesota. We're on the cusp of being able to predict outbreaks, using that data mining to be able to predict risk and outbreaks, and we're looking forward to getting some more about that. In order to keep an eye on it domestically, we also have to be able to ensure that we don't miss something. And one of the things that I want to make everybody aware of is that the center has a program for supporting diagnostic fees in the cases when the first round of diagnostics have happened and there isn't a good diagnosis, there isn't a good etiology, or it's not satisfactory. Maybe the diagnostic lab reports something, but the practitioner says, no, I don't think that's it. And in those kinds of cases, there's a process that's available on the SHIC website to go through to get support for further diagnostic work, because we sure don't want to miss something if it's out there. And that's something for the producers and veterinarians to be aware of, that we have a program to help with that. Talked about tracheitis in Canada. This is a distinct clinical syndrome that has a distinct honking kind of coughing that was first identified in Quebec a few years ago, and it's moved slowly but steadily across Canada. We have some cases in the U.S. now. We've had a webinar on this where we've had practitioners with experience as well as diagnosticians to talk about the syndrome and the need for standardized submissions. The webinar can be found on the swinehealth.org website, and you'll see more to come about this as we do some more investigation. This is one of the examples of offering further investigation with diagnostic services that I just talked about. Another thing that we have had a webinar series on is a myelitis condition that we have seen in feeder pigs and finishers. And this can affect as many as 30% of some finishers. You see the video, and these pigs have difficulty standing. They are incoordinated. But if you can see their eyes, they are aware of what's going on. This isn't necessarily a brain disease. It's a central nervous system disease. Again, it's a syndrome that we've been seeing, something that we don't want to miss, and something that we want to support further diagnostics in, and we're doing that. Again, the webinar series is available for this, available on the swinehealth.org website for more information about this as well. Now let's talk a bit about responding and recovering and some of the things that we have going on in that area. One of the things that the center has done is to learn some lessons from the PED outbreak back in 2013. In 2013, we had conference calls, weekly conference calls about outbreaks around the country, about research that needed to be done, about coordination in messaging and coordination in programs that had to happen. In part, one of the things that those conference calls and that program did was try to identify pathways of entry of this virus onto farms. It was very confusing, and anybody that went through that and remembers that situation, and sometimes the very high biosecurity farms were the ones that broke with PED, and the lower biosecurity farms didn't seem to. So we were confused about just exactly what those pathways could be and how that could happen. That was a research effort and a communication effort, and out of that came a rapid response team type of effort. Back in 2013, we put together teams of diagnosticians, teams of veterinarians to try to quickly get out to these sites where PED broke and do an investigation for us on the possible pathways of entry. One thing we learned there is we were very good at the response. We were very poor at rapid. Even though we had a rapid response type of team, it sometimes took 2 weeks for us to coordinate getting out on the farm after we were invited, getting out on the farm to coordinate flights and coordinate travel because we just didn't have enough people. So we formed a rapid response corps, and this is coordinated through Iowa State University as well. The Rapid Response Corps is based on regions around the country where these diagnosticians, veterinarians, these experts will be able to be on the farm within 72 hours after the invitation, notification and invitation of the producer to say, come out and help me so I can understand where this is coming from and how I can address it. So that we've been exercising that for the last 3 or 4 years. I think we've made some real strides in that, and that's an important thing in response because we have to, in response, the speed of the response is primary in how we'll be able to manage it. So response, and another lesson from the PED outbreak was a need for coordinated national response rather than individual situation response. And this is response to these non-regulatory diseases. It's not an African swine fever, a foot and mouth or classical swine fever issue. This is a pork production, a U.S. production responsibility, coordinated national response to these emerging diseases like PED. As part of that, Pork Board, NPPC, AASV, along with USDA, state animal health officials, and the North American Meat Institute have all formed or all on a National Swine Disease Council. And that National Swine Disease Council is modeled after the old pseudorabies eradication management group that oversaw the program standards of the pseudorabies eradication program and helped to coordinate that effort. We put together producers, veterinarians, associations, state animal health officials, USDA as an advisor, and others, so we can all be together on this response and look at how the coordination of response can happen through all of these entities, so we can be together in the responses as we go for these production type of diseases. This is an example of the different types of responses. They can be very passive and they can be very active. No response is a response. If that National Swine Disease Council gets together and hears about something happening out in the country, on the farms, no response may be appropriate. It may be appropriate for further situational awareness, and let's keep an eye on it. As well as a response could be all the way to, we'd recommend that we have stop movement until we know what's happening. I mean, these are things that are real, and this is an effort to get the whole pork production and allied industries and government officials together for a coordinated response to try to make sure that we do the best we can do and not repeat what we had with PED back in 2013. Now let's go into ASF a bit with some time that we have left and talk about ASF and some ongoing work in preventing ASF from getting here and being able to contain, respond, and recover in the case that it might. August 3rd, 2018 is when we first learned of the outbreak in northeast China. That was the day that China officially announced their initial outbreak. And at that point, in August of 2018, the only tissue that was officially approved for ASF testing in the U.S. was whole blood. And if you wanted to monitor, or if you wanted to test for, if you wanted to do a surveillance program for ASF, and at that point we had no official surveillance program for it, we had to use whole blood as the only tissue that we could use. USDA responded very quickly. You've got to give them credit for their response. And in September, we were sitting with USDA talking about the need for expanded tissues and expanded testing, surveillance program, and they responded very quickly. By the first of the year, 2019, they had approved tonsils, spleen, lymph nodes as additional tissues that were approved for ASF testing. A very important thing, because if we're going to do ASF testing as part of a hemorrhagic disease surveillance program, which was then stood up as an official surveillance program, not just for ASF, but also included CSF, classical swine fever, because they can look an awful lot alike in the diagnostic lab and out on the farm. If we were going to use those as a surveillance program, then we needed to include the kinds of tissues and the kinds of samples that routinely would come into the diagnostic lab for cases that would be case compatible with the types of signs that you would see with CSF or ASF. Whole blood is usually not part of that tissue that's submitted to the diagnostic lab. So USDA helped a lot by setting up the hemorrhagic disease surveillance program that includes not only classical swine fever, it includes African swine fever, and started that program so we can get a better handle on making sure that we can detect ASF or CSF should it get into the country. I talked about the veterinary diagnostic labs and hemorrhagic disease case compatible for official testing. That's within the diagnostic labs and those samples. But there are other surveillance streams that are also incorporated into the surveillance program. It's not just the diagnostic labs, but also in marketing and the packing plants. Any lesions that would be identified by the inspectors as case compatible would be railed off and would be held for further testing. Feral pig mortalities, we aren't going to go out and shoot feral pigs and test them for ASF. We aren't going to go out for depopulation and test those. But one of the lessons that we've learned about ASF, especially in Eastern Europe, is that the virus can last in carcasses for a long time, and especially when you have feral pig mortalities, infection in feral pigs, and you've got those mortalities, they can lay out in the country, and other feral pigs can come around and they'll scavenge on those carcasses, and that will continue to spread ASF. So one of the things that we've worked with USDA on, and they've included in their surveillance stream, is if there are any mortalities of feral pigs that are discovered, then we want those to be tested for ASF to make sure we aren't missing something that could be there. The other part of this is in some states, the feeding plate waste or garbage feeding is allowed, and that is under a USDA inspection program where states and federal officials routinely go out onto those types of farms that have licenses for doing this type of feeding for pigs, and another surveillance stream for this hemorrhagic disease is to look for, and if found, test anything that might be case compatible out on these types of facilities as well. So that officially started in June of 2019 through December 31st. You'll see the number of samples, a good number of tonsils, but I think one of the things that shows progress, especially, is the majority of samples coming from spleen, and that tissue being part of the regular submissions that go into the diagnostic labs. So they're routinely being able to test if those are case compatible cases that come in. Next thing is this project in Vietnam, and this is something that I'm really excited about. Through the USDA Foreign Ag Service and with the support of the National Pork Producers Council, Swine Health Information Center was able to get a grant from the FAS, USDA FAS, in September of 2019. And that grant is to build capacity to support control of ASF in Vietnam. FAS, their objective is to support international trade for U.S. commodities. And we made the case to them that our ability to provide to Vietnam the technical support for helping to control ASF will help to facilitate international trade for pork products over in Vietnam. NPPC, the National Pork Producers Council, has a long history of providing technical assistance to different countries to help facilitate trade with those different countries, and that's been successful. So the Foreign Ag Service accepted that proposal, and that proposal includes two sections. One is the strengthening of the veterinary services capacity, and that's coordinated through the University of Minnesota. A really important project. It's educational. It is the types of webinars, types of workshops, the types of educational materials, both for the Vietnamese equivalent to USDA, as well as their veterinarians and their producers, to make sure that we are helping provide to them the most up-to-date and helpful information about African swine fever epidemiology, control, etc., virology, vaccinology, all of those types of things. A very important educational project, and again, that's coordinated through the University of Minnesota. The section two is field projects and collection and analysis of samples. This is the one that really, as a veterinarian, does really excite me, because this is the one where we're making the case that unlike PED happened in 2013, where the National Pork Board had to step up and do research very quickly because we knew little about PED in 2013 when it broke. We needed to do research very quickly to try to learn lessons about epidemiology, about control, about biosecurity, about all the things we needed to know about PED and the outbreak. That was after the outbreak. And one of the lessons we learned from that is let's not do that again, especially with ASF. And this grant from FAS gives us the opportunity to learn some of those lessons with field projects, collection and analysis of samples. Where the University of Minnesota was in charge of the educational programs, you see some of the logos of the variety of different organizations that are cooperating on these. And this is a list of some of the things that we're doing, along with the National Pork Board and National Pork Board's cooperation and their support in some of these projects as well. So while the center has the FAS grant and can support these projects, and you see that these are all about learning lessons for control, management and control, the types of things we need to know right away if we get the virus. The National Pork Board also is contributing funds to help answer some of these questions as well. So it's a really good collaborative effort. And I won't read down through the list of things that are here, but these are a list of some of the studies that are going on. We're trying to get these done as quickly as we can. Certainly the international issues and the travel issues with COVID have been a barrier to getting things going quickly. But I think we've made really good progress, and we're being flexible enough to make plans around the issues we have with travel and doing a lot of things by webinars, et cetera. You see the wide variety of things, and it's this is the type of thing that I think is really exciting about learning these lessons before we get ASF. We want to keep it out and we want to prevent it, but boy, if we get it, these are the types of things we have to have in our pocket once we get it so we can control it. On that initial list, you didn't see oral fluids, and that's because I wanted to point out especially the issues on oral fluids and oral fluid testing that we're going through right now. The Oral Fluid Project is being coordinated through the Canadian Food Inspection Service, CFIA, and along with collaboration with USDA, we're looking at testing oral fluid, the use of oral fluids on the farms in Vietnam as a monitoring and surveillance program. Finding farms early enough to start oral fluid collection and to be able to test then the sensitivity of using the oral fluid sensitivity in monitoring and surveillance. Essentially, what we really, in simple terms, what we want to do is we want to make sure that if we're monitoring oral fluids for ASF, that we can find ASF in those oral fluids as soon as the first pig in a pen gets infected. You know, oral fluids are collective. They're in our finishers, in group house systems for a variety of different diseases that we use here. It's an efficient and cost-effective way to monitor for disease. We want to see if we can do this with oral fluids for ASF and support that as a monitoring and surveillance project. Should we get ASF, we want to be able to use that as a tool in our toolbox in order to be able to monitor and respond. Not only on the farms in Vietnam, but also there's been support for CFIA and USDA, both doing oral fluid experiments within the laboratory, and we're using all of that information to help provide USDA and CFIA with the data they can get to do the analysis to see if oral fluids are sensitive enough to be able to detect that first pig that gets infected in the pen. As far as collective tissues for ASF outbreaks, there's also a project that's coordinated through the University of Minnesota as part of the National Farm Bill. And in the Preparedness and Response grants, this is outside of the Swine Health Information Center, but I wanted to make sure that people are aware that this alternative tissues project's also going on, where they're working with USDA as well to look at the use of swabbing blood for ASF testing. So that very well may be a very important alternative tissue where we would be able to use swabs of spleens, maybe out in the countryside. We wouldn't have to do complete postmortems on mortalities. If we could get a blood swab from a spleen, we may be able to prevent further contamination of the site. Or, for example, in bore studs, where you could do a prick of a vein in the ear and collect blood swab from that for an ASF test to monitor and do surveillance for ASF instead of having to take whole blood from live animals. Because one of the things about the tissues that expansion of tissues was very welcome, but the only one that is still antemortem or live animal tissue is whole blood. That's the only thing that's approved at this time. So if we want to do surveillance and testing in live animals, we still have to use whole blood. We're working on oral fluids. We're looking at the use of blood swabs. So what's the issue with oral fluids? USDA has said that they have confidence in a positive result, but because of this issue with sensitivity, they don't know yet that they can have confidence in a negative result. If we find it, we know it's there. But if we don't find it, we don't know that we're missing it. And so that's part of this project with the sensitivity of oral fluids and the PCRs, because the questions remain, will sick pigs chew on ropes? And oral fluids is a composite sample. And one of the things that we want to make sure we get the right data on and do a good job looking for is if oral fluids dilute the ASF virus itself in the oral fluids, if it dilutes it out so far that the sensitivity of our PCR tests can't pick it up. Because there is a lower detection rate, there's a lower limit of sensitivity for the PCR test, and that's the issue of where we want to make sure that in a pen of pigs that just break with ASF, that we can pick up that first pig that is contributing antigen, contributing virus to the oral fluids collection out of the pen. As part of that, the data needs a collection of data that has to happen. We have to have adequate test numbers to be able to validate. There's question about Vietnamese pork production and whether it's representative of U.S. production, because remember, all of this that's happening is happening out on farms in Vietnam. So we have to pick the right farms, we have to get there early, and we have to make sure that we can do the right job. We're making the case that this is the collection of data that hopefully we can get to USDA and CFIA for their analysis, because really the objective here is just like learning those other lessons about management. We don't want to have to learn lessons about whether or not we can use oral fluids after an outbreak. We want to use Vietnam as the test country, the test outbreak, so we can validate oral fluids and validate the use of them if it's appropriate. And I'll give the caveat that we still have to have the data. But if that data is there, we need validation of oral fluids prior to an outbreak so we can quickly respond. We don't want to have to wait months or a year later to be able to use oral fluids as a live animal tissue of collection for monitoring and surveillance. Because the current plan, I want to make sure everybody's also aware, the current plan is whole blood collected from a site, like we did with pseudorabies back in the pseudorabies eradication program, at a 95% confidence level of detecting at least a 5% infection within the herd. And that means 60 samples. In a large herd, that means 60 samples. So the proposal is that we collect 30 a day for 2 days. This has got to be whole blood. That's the only tissue that is approved for ASF testing in the live animal right now. It's got to be whole blood, 30 samples for 2 days, 30 each for 2 days. And then talking about some combination, there may be some combination of mortalities, testing different mortalities or mortalities along with whole blood, or maybe mortalities along with oral fluids in order to be able to get a good surveillance and a good response to being able to make sure we can identify negative farms. We want to make sure, because you've got to be able to identify a negative farm in order to be able to move animals in the face of an outbreak with permission and the secure pork supply plan and all the things that have to happen in order for state animal health officials and USDA to have confidence that animals that will have to continue to move as part of continuing business are negative and won't be spreading ASF. All right, now to finish up, some of the lessons learned, and Chris mentioned the COVID-19 outbreak and some of the things that we've all been experiencing for the last 3 to 4 months. But you know, some of the things that we've experienced in the last 3 to 4 months are lessons in epidemiology and lessons in outbreak response. And I think the first lesson is that you have to be able to respond quickly. And I'm not going to go into appropriateness of the COVID response. These are lessons that we need to apply to an outbreak for animal health and for swine health. Time is the enemy during an outbreak. You've got to be able to respond quickly. We can't wait for oral fluid validation after an outbreak if we're going to be responding quickly. We can't wait to learn those lessons of management and control and biocontainment, as well as biosecurity after an outbreak. We have to learn about test availability prior to the outbreak, make sure we have both adequate amount and adequate quality of our test availability prior to the outbreak. The diagnostic capabilities and the surge capacity within the diagnostic labs is critical, because we may have adequate tests and adequate quality, but if the diagnostic labs are overwhelmed with these tests and aren't able to get them turned around in time, then we still have to wait. The traceability and being able to do trace backs and trace forwards and contact tracing in the face of an outbreak is extremely important, because that's the way that we're going to be able to limit the scope of the outbreak. We've got to know how far it's gone, where it is, and in order to do that, we've got to have traceability of our pigs. We've got to be able to do that as an animal health issue. The surveillance and response plan have to be in place prior to the outbreak. We don't have time after we have an ASF outbreak for us all to get together and sit down and say, okay, let's figure out how we're going to respond and how we're going to do surveillance on this and testing. The USDA has said we're going to have a hold for 72 hours, hold on movement for 72 hours. We have to have a plan for how that's released, what the data is that has to happen to be collected for the analysis, for being able to say, okay, we know enough after 72 hours or after some period of time that we can go ahead and go forward. Now, surveillance and response plan prior to the outbreak is important. Another thing we've learned from the COVID issue and the backup of pigs from the packing plan issues that have happened is it's real easy during an ASF exercise or any disease exercise to say, yep, we're going to depopulate and we're going to dispose of this population. We're going to clean this farm off and depopulate the animals and dispose. That was not an easy thing that happened in in the response to COVID and the packing plant issues. We certainly learned a lesson there about the need for coordination, the need for resources, and that gets into the National Veterinary Stockpile and the lack of resources that was in there to assist the pork industry. The National Veterinary Stockpile is a USDA effort to make sure there's in place resources necessary to help in a disease outbreak. It has done that with avian influenza outbreaks in the poultry industry, but it hasn't done that for large animal types of outbreaks and large animal issues for depopulation and disposal, like we've experienced in the last few months in the pork industry. Another couple of easy things to go through, but hard things to do, is site security. The lessons learned about site security, where this depopulation and disposal is going on, and how we ensure that the security of that site, the confidential information remains there, and we can make that happen. And also, an extremely important piece of this is the mental health assistance that producers and veterinarians need out in the countryside when they have to depopulate and dispose of carcasses. We're all trained as pork producers and as veterinarians to take care of these animals, to help these animals, to make sure that they are productive. They are alive, they're productive, they live, and they serve us. But when we have to go through depopulation and disposal, that can be very, very disturbing. And that mental health assistance was something that we learned in this COVID issue that we have to pay attention to should we have an outbreak. All of this and more is on the Swine Health Information Center website, www.swinehealth.org. A lot of things up there, especially about our response plans, rapid response teams, the diagnostic services, the programs. You can go on there and sign up for the newsletter. My contact information is up there. I welcome any phone call, any email from anybody about any of these programs. We want to do the best job we can do to be responsive for the pork industry.